one of the weaknesses, I think, of his political position, which infuriated him, as you point out, when people would point this out, when his adversaries would point this out, is that a lot of the times when he's talking, it does sound like Nazi talking points. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined in my partner in all things strategy, Eliot Cohen, who's professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and also a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, welcome.
Well, it's good to be back with you. I've just had a couple of wonderful days not thinking about politics. I was at a magic convention, which, among other things, featured Balsamo, the talking skull that does card tricks. But that's not really relevant to what we're going to be discussing today.
Well, we do have a very special guest today, Professor H.W. Brands, who is the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair of History at the University of Texas at Austin, and also father of Hal Brands, a frequent guest on Shield of the Republic, and most important today, author of America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War, a fascinating study of the conflict between Charles Lindbergh and FDR in the run-up to World War II. Professor Brands, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Thank you for having me on. Delighted to be here.
I wonder if I could just start us off by asking you to tell us what drew you to this subject, particularly at this point in time.
When Donald Trump became president in 2017, it became evident to me that the consensus that the United States needed to be the leader of the world, and that this entailed upholding commitments that had been made since the late 1940s, pretty much without question, was coming into question for the first time. It had been pretty much a solid consensus from the late 40s into the first years of the first Trump administration. And I thought that this was significant. Almost 80 years out from World War II, I was a little bit surprised that the issue hadn't been debated more fully before then, but finally it was. And so I thought, okay, well, it's time to take a look at the origin of this debate. And so I wanted to get sort of right at where it began with the question of whether the United States should enter the Second World War. And once I decided on that topic, it was a fairly straightforward matter to identify two protagonists to the debate. Now, I deliberately made the choice of focusing on two individuals. I wanted to pose this essentially as a back and forth between individuals who have different points of view, rather than try to draw in all the people on the side of intervention, all the people on the side of staying out of the war. And I realize, of course, that this narrows things a bit, but I think it can make it more engaging for readers, as long as I provide enough explanation and context for all this. So one of my protagonists was, of course, going to be Franklin Roosevelt. He's president of the United States. His position in this debate doesn't require an explanation at all. Charles Lindbergh's does, because Lindbergh did not hold political office. Lindbergh was not known as a deep thinker on foreign affairs. He wasn't a writer. The only thing he was we'd call him a celebrity. He had been a popular hero by virtue of having flown across the Atlantic by himself in 1927. And America took him to its heart. More robustly than he hoped, he got tired of all the attention. His celebrity was transformed when the infant son of Charles Lindbergh and his wife was kidnapped and murdered in the early 1930s. And this made Lindbergh the subject both of, the same sort of celebrity, but in a different way. So the poor guy, the tragedy has befallen him and all of this. It also made him even more intensely the focus of an emerging new style of media. And this was newsreels. These are the forerunner of television. So you can actually see, these are short movies that were made by the movie studios and that were shown often before and after and during the intermissions of movies on Saturdays when people go to the movie theaters. And Lindbergh was catnip to the people making these, because a good-looking guy who had all this fame, this tragedy befell him. The kidnapping and the murder was called the crime of the century. The trial was the trial of the century. And so he couldn't go anywhere from that time forward without cameras chasing him, without people trying to get him to talk about this and that and the other thing. He had hardly a moment to himself. So this shapes his thinking a lot about modernity and what this all involves. And it does influence his position in this debate. But anyway, the one thing that he was really good at, and the solid reason that he took part in this debate, in fact, took the leading part in the debate on the anti-intervention side, was that he knew a lot about aircraft. He knew a lot about aircraft from having helped design, build, and fly his own. But because he was this famous figure, the air corps, the air forces of the world wanted to get his opinion. He liked to travel, and when he would travel to Germany, he would be invited to see the latest German aircraft factories, and he would talk to the air marshals and the commanders there. When he flew to France, same thing, Britain, Russia, Japan, Italy. And so if one wanted to know what the state of the art of military aircraft was in the mid to late 1930s, Charles Lindbergh was the guy to consult. He was in regular communication with the U.S. War Department. He was colonel of the reserve, the Army Air Corps Reserve. And so when he would come to Washington, he'd report to the War Department and say, okay, this is what's going on. And so he had this certain expertise in what in the minds of many people was shaping up to be the new military technology that might be decisive in another war, should such a war break out. So that's really that, and the sort of tangential aspect of his father having been a member of Congress during the First World War. Now, this was more a motivation for Lindbergh than it was a particular reason for anybody to listen to Lindbergh. When I say listen, so also this is a debate that is largely carried out on the radio. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, as president, he could command a radio audience whenever he wanted. He just could give speech, and his speeches would be broadcast. Lindbergh was different. He was a private citizen. But because he was famous, and this is crucial, because he was famous, he'd get an audience. And when he would call it the Mutual Broadcasting System, or CBS, or the other radio stations and networks, they would put him on because they knew they'd get an audience, they could sell commercials, and it would be a going commercial concern. So perhaps a little bit to his surprise, and he protests this in his diary. Maybe he protests a bit too much, sort of against his inclination. He becomes the voice of the anti-intervention movement. And again, the narrow question is, should the United States get involved in a war that has just broken out in Europe in September 1939? There's another war going on in Asia, and this would join the European war to become what we would call World War II. But they were spoken of almost entirely separately in the American political context. 95% of the debate was about the war in Europe, and the war in Asia was a separate thing. It linked sort of once Japan forms an alliance with Germany and Italy, but in thinking, very different. Anyway, so the background for this, and the background is really important, because the default setting of American politics as of the mid-1930s was anti-interventionist. Yeah, so the American public was overwhelmingly opposed to intervention in American participation in any future European war. Americans had been talked out of 130 years of, I won't use the term isolation because that's a term that's actually coined by the critics of this position, but non-intervention in European affairs. A position that had been America's basic policy since George Washington. And they'd been talked out of this to join the First World War. And they were happy enough to do it. They were persuaded by Woodrow Wilson. It was important. It was going to make the world safe for democracy and that. But then it turned out not to do that. And not long after the Paris Peace Conference, the needle on American public opinion turned against the idea, both retrospectively. It was a bad idea to get involved in World War I. And it would be an even worse idea to get involved in any future war. So this was written into law in the mid-1930s. A series of Neutrality Acts, as they were called, forbade the President of the United States from doing the kinds of things that Woodrow Wilson had got that progressively pulled the United States closer to war in Europe the first time around, and then ultimately led to the United States joining the war. So in 1939, the strong opinion in the United States was still against the idea that the United States should get involved in this war that was breaking out. This seemed to be a war that was certainly mostly the responsibility of Hitler, but that also reflected, in the thinking of many Americans, misjudgments on the part of Britain and France, who had in American view, who had the prime responsibility for containing Hitler if Hitler and the Nazis needed to be contained. And by the fact that they hadn't done a very good job doing that caused many Americans to suspect that they were relying on the United States once again bailing them out, which caused a lot of Americans to think even more, well, we're not going to do it. We did it the first time and they screwed up the peace. And so we're not going to do it the second time. So when the focus of my story begins, basically September 1st, 1939, the situation is that the United States, most Americans think we're not going to get involved. And then to trace the trajectory, over the next 2 years and 4 months, the United States gets closer and closer to involvement and finally does get involved. Now, the final impetus is the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. But that follows all sorts of measures that progressively move the United States from this neutral position to one of deep involvement on the side opposing the fascists. So this is the story that I tell. And when the story begins, Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany. So the war is on. Franklin Roosevelt claims to be opposed to the idea of American intervention in the war. Now, Roosevelt claims this almost right up until Pearl Harbor. So he concludes before Pearl Harbor that the United States will get involved and ought to get involved. And so the question is, and this question for me as a historian or anybody else interested in the subject is, at what point does he realize that it's going to happen? But he disguises, when he does reach the point where he thinks it's going to happen, he still disguises that point because he doesn't want to tell Americans that it's going to happen because he knows they don't want to hear it. And so Roosevelt's goal is to move American policy to the point where war becomes acceptable, and then even better, war becomes inevitable. Wow. And I don't mean to make Roosevelt look like a villain here. Roosevelt concluded that it was in the interest of the United States, it was in the interest of humanity for the United States to take on Nazi Germany. That was the prime enemy. And his problem was, how do I do that when Americans don't want to hear that? And so, the way things turned out, a lot of people would maybe fault Roosevelt for his tactics, but they said he wound up taking the United States to the right place. Okay, so that's Roosevelt's position. Lindbergh, who sort of against all odds became the spokesman for the anti-war side, he finds himself countering Roosevelt. So Roosevelt, as soon as the war breaks out, Roosevelt sends a message to Congress saying he wants to modify the neutrality legislation, allowing the United States to sell weapons to the belligerents. That was one of the things the neutrality legislation said the United States could not do. And Roosevelt made the argument that this embargo on arms to belligerents is actually unneutral in practice. Germany has already built up its war machine. The British and the French are a little bit behind. So to allow them to catch up, we need to be able to sell them weapons. Now, there's one striking difference in this war as opposed to the first war. In the first war, the United States was actually pretty neutral between the opposing parties, between Germany and its allies on one side and Britain and France on the other side. The United States was fairly neutral in 1914 when that war began. In this war, 90% of Americans blamed Hitler, and to a smaller extent Mussolini. But Hitler is the bad guy. The only question was, what should America's response to the bad guy be? And so Lindbergh takes the position that, okay, the United States should not get involved in this war. All the reasons we had for saying we're not going to get involved in a war that were valid in 1935, they're still just as valid. And so what Lindbergh tries to do over the course of the next 2.25 years is to slow down the advance toward war, to point out what he saw to be the fallacies, the misleading aspects of Roosevelt's argument, and to keep the United States out of the war. So that's the broad outline of the story. And the label America First, which is the title of my book, comes from the name of the foremost committee that was opposed to American intervention in the war. It's called the America First Committee. Lindbergh did not initially join the committee. He was not a joining type. He valued what he considered to be his independence of mind and his ability to say what he wanted to say, regardless of what others and what a committee said. Gradually, as he realizes his side is losing the debate, he joins the committee. And so he becomes really the face and the voice of the America First Committee.
And I guess just for the record, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about America First is I believe it starts with a bunch of Yale students, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, this is not a bunch of knuckle draggers by any stretch of the imagination. Just a bit on Lindbergh. He flees the country, but he and his wife basically flee the country. So they're living overseas, mainly in England, although they're traveling a lot. And I guess one of the things that struck me about the book, which, like Eric, I admired enormously, is you get the sense that first he has this sense of Britain in decay and decline. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about why you think he felt that way. And then also when he goes to Germany, he's not a Nazi or anything like that, but he kind of admires the technological prowess of Germany. And there seems to be sort of an affinity. He'll say, the anti-Semitic stuff, that's kind of too bad, but it doesn't bother him, as Eric said. I mean, Kristallnacht doesn't trouble him very much, at least as far as I know. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of those underlying views about sort of British British decline in particular, and the sense of kind of German vitality without, like I said, I don't want to push that too far, but
yeah, well, there's no question that he admired, sort of the stereotypes of Germany. They value order, they can get stuff done, and they seem to be pulling themselves out of the Depression. And they were not living in the past the way he thought the British were. They seem to be living in the future. So he admired German culture. He was troubled by Nazism, the Nazi regime, as much because it puzzled him. It did not seem to be, by any means, the best side of German culture. And he wondered why sort of the good people in Germany put up with this. And he thought that this was actually getting in the way of progress for the world. Now, so some of this is cultural. He took advantage of British hospitality, but he was constantly pointing out how the British, they were still living in the 19th century, and they thought they were the great power, but they had let it decline. And one of the things he held against the British is, and a lot of people share this view, they had bitten off more than they were willing to chew, bitten off at the Paris Peace Conference. They imposed this regime on Europe, and then they're not willing to sustain it. And so how can you respect something like that? Now, there's a paradox with Lindbergh in this, where he kind of looks down, when he travels around Britain, he sees signs of decay, and these families weren't what they used to be, and the old houses weren't what they used to be. But in some ways, he's himself a man of the 19th century. And although he flies everywhere in the latest airplanes, and he really values advancements in aircraft technology, he always talks about how he hates modernity, he hates cities. The one thing he likes most about flying is that it takes him above the cities. It takes him above sort of the hurly-burly. There's another thing that Lindbergh doesn't really acknowledge in himself, but it comes through. He's as skeptical of democracy as many of the Germans are, because the way he'd put it is every idiot gets to vote, and look at the kind of policies, look at what this produces. Now, again, there's another paradox, because one of the things that he faults Roosevelt for as this debate develops, because Roosevelt increasingly says we need to defend Britain. France is defeated, falls out of the war fairly early, but Britain is there. And Roosevelt presents Britain as this bastion of democracy. And so we're fighting for freedom. And Lindbergh points out, if we support Britain, well, Britain may be sort of democratic in Britain, but it's got an empire. We were defending the British Empire. And we're supposed to be, ask anybody in British India, you got a democracy there? And that's what Roosevelt is getting us to sign on to. Now, there are other aspects of Lindbergh that are both sort of characteristic of the age, but perhaps more present in Lindbergh than some others. So one hesitates to use the word racist, but Lindbergh often thought in racial terms, the way a lot of people did in those days. A lot of people in Britain, a lot of people in the United States. Of course, the United States, this is the age of Jim Crow, so this is what you're going to find. But Lindbergh thought about a clash of cultures, a clash of civilizations. And he thought that the fault line between civilizations lay not between Germany and Britain, not in the English Channel or something like that. It lay farther east. It lay actually on the eastern frontier of Germany. He classed Russia as what he would call an Asiatic power, and he linked in his mind Russia and China. And he said, no, the real challenge over the next century is between Western Europe and North America and the rest of, Eastern Eurasia, Russia and China. And if we allow ourselves to get distracted, and if Germany fights Britain, well, that's just going to weaken the West for this later showdown. And some of it he casts in terms of the white race against the yellow races and so on. But he hasn't really thought this through very well, and he's parroting some stuff that he's heard from other people. So that does influence his thinking. But at the heart of it all, I write this story as a debate between Roosevelt and Lindbergh. And so Lindbergh is front and center. And I, as people who write about Lindbergh do, I have access to his diaries. So he's constantly talking to himself about what this means and all this. Now, in contrast, Roosevelt's a lot harder to pin down, because Roosevelt, he thought that if he lived to retire, he was going to write his memoirs, and so he built the presidential library for that. But he didn't, and he didn't write his memoirs. And so Roosevelt almost never unburdened himself. Nobody knew what Roosevelt was thinking. And he would have three people into his office in succession. Each one thought that he thought something different. And so to figure out what Roosevelt is thinking is a lot harder than figuring out what Lindbergh is thinking. The best I could do with Roosevelt, in fact, I think the most revealing parts of Roosevelt are when he's holding his press conferences. Now, in those days, the press conferences, they were off the record. If the president, if he allowed himself to be quoted, he could be quoted. They weren't broadcast. So he would sit down in his office with the regular White House press corps, and they would talk. Now, fortunately for the historian, these have all been transcribed, and so we can see what's going on. And so he talks, I say, in a way that appears more candid than when he's given a public speech. And one would expect that. But still, it's hard to know what's going on in his head. He's a real enigma.
I mean, of course, the racial thinking that you point out that Lindbergh engaged in does serve in some way to align him with Nazi thinking. And I'm not saying he's a Nazi, but he was susceptible to these arguments. And so, and one of the weaknesses, I think, of his political position, which infuriated him, as you point out, when people would point this out, when his adversaries would point this out, is that a lot of the times when he's talking, it does sound like Nazi talking points.
Yeah. So this is a problem that the anti-interventionists have, but it's the problem that anti-interventionists always have. When somebody is saying the United States needs to go to war, and you say, no, we don't need to go to war, we shouldn't go to war, objectively, you are taking the position of the side that the United States might go to war against. And this came up, of course, and during the protests against the war in Vietnam, and every other time. So that is true. And the business about Lindbergh's racialized thinking, it contributes to some of his anti-Semitism, which is sort of in the same ballpark. But it's worth knowing, it's worth remembering, as I mentioned this earlier, that this was a time when racial thinking was the norm in America. And if I had to put Roosevelt on a spectrum somewhere, he was probably less overtly racist than the average member of Congress from the South. And, so his anti-Semitism was sort of the, not in my country club variety. So he was opposed, for example, to waiving the quotas on Jewish refugees from Europe once the troubles in Europe begin. But of course, so was Congress, and so was the President of the United States. So he wasn't that far from the median in that. But of course, but the thing is, and this is what is really sort of explodes Lindbergh's reputation and his usefulness to the anti-war side. He says it in public. And in fact, I'm getting ahead of things maybe a little bit here, but after he gives his speech, and this is in the autumn of 1941 in Des Moines, Iowa, where he identifies three groups that are most influential in trying to get the United States into the war in Europe. And the first group that he identifies is Britain, the British government. He says that's perfectly natural. They're at war. They want our help. So they're going to try to get us involved. The second group is Jewish Americans. He said that's perfectly natural. Their relatives, their friends, people of the same religion of them are being persecuted. And, they have every right to their opinion. I just don't think that should guide American policy. He saved his sharpest criticism for the Roosevelt administration. He said, frankly, Franklin Roosevelt is trying to lie us into the war. So when he said this, the next day, newspapers all over the country blew up, and this is Lindbergh, an anti-Semite, and for injecting this issue of religion into the debate. And that was the term was usually put, injecting religion into the debate. And so Lindbergh was kind of puzzled by this because he said, well, first of all, did I say anything that wasn't true? Because what he said was the Jewish Americans are trying to get the United States into the war, and they are overrepresented in the media of the day. And he probably exaggerated that overrepresentation part. But so he was speaking with Herbert Hoover, and he says, well, what did I say that was wrong? And Hoover said, it's not that what you said was wrong, is you were wrong to say it. And so this confirmed Lindbergh in his belief that politics was this dirty business where people have to shade their views. They can't say, what they really think. They can't say how they perceive the world. So anyway.
Well, although as you point out, in the newspaper editorial aftermath of the Des Moines speech, most of the editorialists for the Herald Tribune and New York Times and others point out that the way he framed the issue was that Jews were defined as Jews, not as Americans who happened to be Jews. So that they were, categorized in a different way than, say, the Roosevelt administration was.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly true. And he was utterly sort of insensitive to the peculiar position that Jews in America and in Europe and elsewhere have had historically. So his political sensitivity, his political radar was utterly undeveloped. So I mean, that's that part of the story. That's
Eliot. I want to kick this over to you, but you just touched, Professor Brands, on something that struck me throughout the book, which is, he's very conscious of his image, very self-conscious about his image, and he very much wants to be seen as above politics, even as he's engaging in the most important political debate, before the country. And that seems to me to be a bit of a paradox in his character. And as you say, politically he was a total naive and I think very ill-suited to political life. And in some sense, he understood that because when people approach him to run for office, he declines. But I'm just curious if you would comment on it. And Eliot, of course, please feel free to jump in here.
Well, why don't you respond to that?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, yes. So Roosevelt never commented, at least that I read anywhere, on his perception of Lindbergh as a political opponent. He spoke very often about his feelings about Lindbergh and Lindbergh's trying to keep the United States out of this war that Roosevelt increasingly believes the United States needed to get into. But I think that Roosevelt must have just rubbed his hands in glee at, this is the guy that I have to deal with. Because Lindbergh really was sort of a very innocent person in politics. And of course, Lindbergh prided himself on this, but Roosevelt was able to sort of set him up and, knock him down when he needed to. And so Lindbergh was definitely out of his depth in this political battle with Roosevelt, which is what it came down to.
One of there's a great quote in there that you bring in from Harold Nicholson, who was a diplomat and then an historian, and briefly had a kind of a minor political career during the war, who had known Lindbergh and had been friendly with him. He said, he's not only a schoolboy hero, he's a schoolboy, which as put downs go, was particularly stinging, but it sounds like it's correct. Well, this may be a little bit of a digression, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Lindbergh, not just as an individual, but representative of a certain school of opinion. I've always been very interested in the United States Army in the 30s. And, you talk about his connection with some of these figures who are not particularly well known, like Truman Smith, who was our military attaché in Berlin, who was brought back and works with Marshall, but was very much a continentalist, did not want the United States really engaged abroad. And I think people don't realize the extent to which some of the most respected figures in the United States Army, there's another one named Stanley Embick, who actually plays an important role during the war. Also, continentalists don't, want the United States just to confine itself to hemispheric defense. To what extent do you think Lindbergh was also representing a school of thought in the United States military, which, as you point out, he remains quite closely plugged into?
Yeah, so I agree with this most emphatically. And Lindbergh and the people who thought like Lindbergh were labeled isolationists, but they were far from isolationists. They were hemispheracists. And Lindbergh believed, as did some of the people in the U.S. Army that you just mentioned, believed that the appropriate frontier for the United States was essentially the boundaries of the Western Hemisphere. And for the United States to go to war on the European continent would weaken the United States. If Germany was an enemy of the United States, if Germany was coming after the United States the way Roosevelt presented it, then the United States should meet them 300 miles off the coast of North and South America. In fact, Lindbergh sketched a plan of strategy that was essentially a militarized Monroe Doctrine on steroids. So he'd say, we will defend North and South America, and we will do it whether the people in North and South America want us to or not. We will seize military bases, air bases in Mexico, in South America, in Canada, if we have to. And we will defend the continent, the two continents together. And so his position was, this is the way to defend America. America gets weaker the farther we go from American shores. And when it was argued by Roosevelt, among others, that modern military aircraft, shrunk the Atlantic Ocean and made the United States more vulnerable to attack from, say, Germany, he said that's exactly wrong. In fact, modern aircraft make the United States less vulnerable if used correctly. Because in the old days, if somebody wanted to launch an invasion of North America, they would put their soldiers on ships, and sort of the first place we would see them is when they came in sight of New York. But with airplanes, we can meet them 300 miles offshore, and we can bomb them before they ever get close. And this is the way modern aircraft should be worked into our defensive planning. So it was not out of any less enthusiasm for defending North America. The question was, where is the best defense for North America to take place?
There's one other angle I'd like to ask you about, which I think is really interesting, which is, and may have some contemporary resonance. Actually, the antagonists are waging an information war in the United States throughout this. I mean, the German effort is a little bit less well known, but it did reach into Congress, and perhaps you could describe that a little bit, George Viereck and some of these other characters. And then, of course,
Hollywood.
Yeah. And so there's very serious German efforts to influence the American opinion, and also extremely serious British efforts to influence American opinion through British security cooperation under William Stephenson. So could you talk a little bit about those efforts, which I find fascinating, and give us your judgment about how important you think they ultimately were? I mean, does the debate really come down to, okay, this is Lindbergh and that school versus FDR and that school, or do you think these information campaigns actually played any role?
I think they did play a role. So it is quite true that once the war got going in Europe, the government of Germany and the government of Britain both did their best to influence American opinion, because they both realized that if the United States entered the war, first of all, it would enter on Britain's side rather than Germany. So that was never a question. The question was whether it would. And if it did, it would tilt the odds very sharply against Germany. So Germany did everything it could to discourage American intervention, and the British did everything they could to encourage American intervention. And the Germans had connections to certain members of Congress, and they wrote editorials and they provided money to campaigns and stuff like this. The British had a much more thorough propaganda operation. They had an advantage that English is their natural language. They also had the cooperation of the Roosevelt administration. The Germans had to put up with opposition from the Roosevelt administration and the FBI. And it wasn't only the official information campaigns, but it was also stuff like, this was almost a serious mistake by Germany. But American reporters, American radio broadcasts couldn't come out of Germany. They were too restricted. And so Americans never heard the German side of the story. But they did hear the British side of the story. So Edward Murrow was telling Americans what it's like to be under the German bombing campaign. And Americans, and this was radio, and so they could hear it as it was happening. And Edward Murrow would tell the story, and Americans could identify with the British, who seemed to be the underdogs in this campaign. And of course, there's that cultural affinity. So I would say that the information war, broadly construed, wound up favoring the British side quite distinctively, and was an important element in this.
Yeah, I think the one other thing I'll just mention on that, and then hand it over to Eric. What the Germans did have, obviously the Brits had a large ethnic community. We don't tend to think of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as a ethnic group, but they are, and they could tap into that in certain social elites. The Germans had German Americans and Irish Americans, and they played those, and there are actually some unbelievable scenes of it was, I think, the Order of Hibernians marching with Nazi flags in Boston. It was quite astounding. So there's a lot of ethnic politics that's going on, which I think is, again, a fascinating part of the context. Eric, over to you.
And because the priesthood in the Catholic Church in the United States was so heavily Irish American, it also affected the senior ranks of the Catholic Church in the United States, and not just through the influence of Father Coughlin, who was maybe Rush Limbaugh's most sort of lineal predecessor as a kind of radio commentator, but also the church itself. I wanted to go back, Professor Brands, to something that you were talking about with Eliot. In some sense, you were talking about continental defense and Lindbergh's views of that. I mean, in some sense, it seems to me that Lindbergh was wrong about a bunch of big questions, but right about some others. I mean, so he seems to have been, somebody who seriously underestimated the resilience of democracies in general, overvalued what Eliot called the vitality of the dictatorships, but their ability to be successful militarily. He also seems to, I mean, at least in terms of the consensus that you described at the outset of the conversation, it seems to me Roosevelt was more right than wrong about, where the boundaries of American national defense needed to be in an era of transoceanic navies and the onset of the aviation age, not to mention the nuclear age that would be born at the very tail end of the conflict. And Stanley Embeck, in some sense, represents that because he's probably the greatest articulator inside the Army staff of continental defense, at the outset of this period. By the end of it, he's the one who's essentially sketching out the system of bases that we will need for forward defense around the world, in Europe and Asia, in the post-war era. And in that sense, I think maybe Lindbergh is vindicated in that particular regard, because he argues that if we get involved in this war in World War II, there will be no turning back. The United States will have to be permanently involved in the political affairs of Europe going forward. And he ends up being, right about that. I don't know if you want to comment or all of that.
So I do have to say one thing about Lindbergh sort of overestimating the resilience of the dictators. It's really important to remember in all this that one of the dictators was on America's side. And so, Stalin and the Russians, the Soviets, they were absolutely instrumental in the defeat of Germany. And so, again, when Roosevelt would make the case that this is a war for democracy, it sort of boggled Lindbergh's imagination as long as it was just Britain that the United States was asked to aid. But when the United States started sending Lend-Lease aid to Stalin and the Soviet Union, said, what are we doing here? You cannot say this is a war for democracy. The winners out of this one are going to be the worst dictatorship in Europe. But leave that in May. I will also say that, yes, Lindbergh underestimated the productive capacity of the United States, for example. But so did everybody else. Nobody before the war had any idea that the United States could produce all the stuff that it did. So there's that. There's another there's deeper point that I want to make, and that is that the narrow question that was being argued was whether the United States would enter the ongoing war against Nazi Germany. The larger question was increasingly framed as the debate went on, especially by Roosevelt, was, will the United States become the essential power in world order? Should the United States become the leader of the world? Now, this was the Wilsonian in Roosevelt that was coming out. And Roosevelt was a Wilsonian back in the days of Wilson. He was in the Wilson administration. And he was a closet internationalist through the 1920s and 1930s. He kept his mouth shut. He was a very canny politician, didn't say anything about it during the 1930s, but it's coming out now. And as much as anything, this was what Lindbergh was criticizing. He said, as you mentioned, he said, if we go into Europe again, we're never going to get out. If we fight this war on the terms that Roosevelt is describing for us, there is no place on earth that we might not be called upon to defend. Because Roosevelt was saying that this is an abiding struggle between these two ways of life, and was essentially saying that if democracy is attacked anywhere, then it is in danger everywhere. And so, be aware, Americans, says Lindbergh, this is the path you're going down. And so think about it very carefully.
Yeah. Of course, at the end of the day, Roosevelt's judgment, and I think we would agree, was the correct one. That, if we had not gotten involved in that war, what would the world look like? And I think the answer is pretty awful. I have to say, one thing I'm struck by it's the way in which Lindbergh, you described this very well. Lindbergh has this prestige as an expert, as a technical expert, because of flying across the Atlantic. But actually, that first he gets the understanding of him as an expert kind of expands, so that he becomes this sort of authority on strategy, and he's talking about the Maginot Line. He doesn't actually know anything about ground combat, but he talks about it nonetheless. But I'm struck that even as a technical expert, he judges that the Me-109 is a very good fighter plane, so sort of the standard German fighter plane. I don't know that he ever flew the Spitfire, which from a technical point of view was just as good. Actually, the British aircraft industry was quite sophisticated. He's way off in terms of his assessment of what the Germans can actually produce. I mean, he comes away saying they're going to produce 20,000 planes a year, and I think he's saying this in '38 when they were nowhere close to that. I just think it's an interesting sort of cautionary tale of what happens when you have somebody who is, has unquestionable expertise in a narrow field, which, in his case is design of fighter planes, not even, I think, multi-engine aircraft. And then it kind of expands into credibility about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and I would add that there is sort of a demonstration of susceptibility to confirmation bias here, in that Lindbergh did not want the United States to go to war against Germany. So he is susceptible to arguments that would make that unlikely or a bad idea. And so the Germans are much better armed than we thought they were. And of course, a lot of this is projecting future developments, and the future is always kind of obscure. So, and Lindbergh, to an extent that I'm pretty sure he didn't recognize, he was played by Germany. And there were people in Germany who put on the best face for the Nazi regime. Now, sometimes there are parts of that regime you couldn't disguise. But there were others who would tell him, those crazies, don't be too worried about those. And so, they showed him what they wanted him to see. And he wasn't either motivated enough or shrewd enough to see through that. And then he repeated it because it strengthened the argument that he wanted to make. And if he had concluded that the German capacity was half of what it was, he still would have made the same argument, but he wouldn't have used that particular bit of evidence.
I want to talk about, I'd like to, as we start to, wrap up our conversation, because we're beginning to run a little short of time, I'd like to come back to where you started, which was sort of the, contemporary overtones of the arguments that Lindbergh articulated in Donald Trump today, and maybe even Elon Musk. I'd like to see you compare, both of them. But before we get there, there's one final question I have on Lindbergh's character, because we've talked about a lot of different elements of it, which I only discovered from reading your book. I suppose I should have known this, somehow. But the fact that in the last 20 years, it's been revealed that Lindbergh, starting in the late 1950s and the last 20 years of his life, had multiple affairs and multiple children with 3 different German women. Lindbergh is on, at great pains throughout, the whole period of your book, that's the subject of your book, the period in 1939 essentially to 1941, to say, I'm an American. I don't, I'm not expressing the view of Germany or Germans. I don't have a sympathy with the Germans. I'm an American first. And yet at the end of his life, he betrays his wife, who's a beloved American author, very popular. I mean, her book, Gift from the Sea, is one of the most popular American books. And has these affairs with these 3 women and fathers these children with them. What do you think is going on there? How do you explain that?
I did not have a good explanation for that at all. The one thing that I would say is that if it were put to Lindbergh, is this an aspect of your admiration for Germany? Well, okay, he felt an affinity, obviously, toward these German women, but he would have said that that did not translate into an affinity for the Nazi regime. Okay, and of course, by the 1950s, Germans are allies of the United States, so that's not an aspect of it there. One of the things that I had to try to balance in writing the book is how much weight to give to the character of Lindbergh. Of course, he's one of my main figures, so we got to pay attention to some of his character. But he would have said, and I think most people would have said, that the argument that he makes is independent of the person that he was. So he makes the argument, here's the evidence. What do you make of the argument based on the evidence? And if Lindbergh is a good guy, if he's a bad guy, if he is a fellow traveler to the Nazi regime, if he's an anti-Semite, that's sort of beside the point for the argument itself. However, this argument took place in a political context. And after he gave the speech in Des Moines, which caused him to be roundly criticized as an anti-Semite, the America First Committee says, stop giving speeches. We can't have you associated with us anymore. I will say this, and this is important to remember, that as soon as the United States went to war, immediately after Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on Japan and Germany declares war on the United States, Lindbergh volunteers to serve against Japan, against Germany, against anybody. And he's older than he was, but he's still a good pilot. But Roosevelt says no. And Roosevelt says no probably partly because the last thing he wanted was for his harshest critic to go off and become a military hero, but also because there would be sort of natural questions as, is Lindbergh's heart really going to be in this fight if he's been opposing it all along?
Yeah, although he does fly in the Pacific.
He does. So he goes out and the War Department won't take him because Roosevelt says no, we don't want to bring him back. But he becomes a consultant to aircraft manufacturers. And then he takes these new designs out into the field. They won't let him, nobody's going to let him anywhere near Europe, but they allow him to go out to the Pacific. And so he shows the pilots out there how to fly them, and he begins to fly combat missions himself. And in fact, he so impressed Dwight Eisenhower, who didn't see it personally, he was over in the other theater, that in the 1950s, Eisenhower, when he was president, rehabilitates Lindbergh and makes him a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve.
Well, let's wrap up if we can with the overtones for today. I was struck that in the President Trump's inaugural address a week ago, he practically almost verbatim repeats something that Lindbergh says in one of the speeches that you quote, which is that the test of statesmanship is not the wars you fight and win or lose. It's the wars you avoid and don't get into. But I'm also struck that there are some overtones of Elon Musk here, which is to say a figure from technology who becomes, in some sense, if not an American hero, at least a celebrity. The critique of the mainstream media, Lindbergh was very critical of the Hollywood, of the newsreels, of the media, the press in general, except for the Chicago Tribune and other elements of the press that supported the America First position. He comments, as Eliot points out, on a lot of things that he doesn't really know about, like Elon. So I'm just curious what you make of the parallels with Trump and with Musk.
Well, one big difference between Lindbergh and Musk is a genius at making money. Lindbergh inherited money, married into money, and so he didn't worry about that. Musk, where Lindbergh's natural feeling looked backwards toward the 19th century and toward the countryside, the wilderness, the unspoiled part of America. Musk, of course, is aiming for outer space and Mars. So, and Musk has been drawn toward politics in a way that, Lindbergh was, but Lindbergh certainly never wanted to cozy up to Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt tried to get him to join the administration, and Lindbergh says no, because he realized that Roosevelt was inviting him in so he could control him. So there's that aspect. But I think the deeper resonance of this debate is over the fundamental question of what's the American role in the world. And the debate centered around the 1940 election. I haven't really said this part, but one of the big areas in which Lindbergh criticized Roosevelt was using this war to extend his time in power. Roosevelt used the excuse of the war to make himself president. Effectively, it turned out for life. And it was really causing Congress to abdicate its role in determining what America's international role would be. And that's supposed to be with Congress, according to the Constitution. But Roosevelt is gradually taking it himself. And I think anybody would agree that that continued. And so the president of the United States today, happens to be Donald Trump, decides where troops are going to be sent, who's going to be fought against, and in areas far beyond just war and peace. Tariffs, immigration, you name it. The center of power in the United States now is the Oval Office in a way that Lindbergh predicted it would be. But again, the deeper question is, what do Americans want the role of their country to be in the world? As I said before, the narrow question was fight against Germany. But beyond that, so the United States adopted Roosevelt's view of what the American role should be. And it went largely unquestioned until Donald Trump became president. Now, that kind of snuck up on Americans because when Donald Trump was running for president, he didn't say a whole lot about foreign policy. And yeah, he adopted the label America first, but nobody knew quite what that meant with Donald Trump. But when Donald Trump ran for president in 2024, been out of office, it was really clear that for the first time, really since 1940, American voters ahead of time knew that they were making a choice. If you choose Kamala Harris, then we're going to continue in that Roosevelt down to Joe Biden view that the United States must be the leading power in the world. If you elect Donald Trump, well, he's really questioned that. We don't know how far the questioning is going to go, but American voters had a choice, and they chose Donald Trump. So this is significant.
Well, that's an appropriate note on which to end. Our guest has been Professor H.W. Brands. His book is America First. It recounts beautifully the struggle between Roosevelt and Lindbergh over American entry into World War II. I know that you'll have a new book out. What are you working on now, Professor Brands? Because I know you're going to have at least one new book next year.
No, it's going to be a little bit longer than that. I'm working on George Washington. A biography, so it's going to take a bit longer. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll still be here, and we'll have you back for that.
So the origins of American anti-interventionism.
We'll look
way
forward
back in the
to
beginning. Okay, very good. I'd be delighted to come back on.
And thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks.